Today, I'm going to tell you a story so raw it will make your chest tighten, set in the dust-scarred heart of the Old West, where the wind smells of sage and gunpowder. That was a land where mercy was thin, and fate often waited at the end of a lonely trail with a loaded revolver. It began with a single footstep in the sand, a small, ordinary sound that was enough to change two lives forever. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Calyx Thorn had always been a fighter, scraping by no matter what the world threw at her, but today her bones felt heavier than the desert rocks themselves. The merciless sun hammered down on the raw, broken land as she pushed through thick stands of pine and scrub. Her worn boots dragged across the dry trail, kicking up faint clouds of dust. Her head was thick with old ghosts, faces she couldn't forget, wounds that never quite closed, all the hard years that had carved her into who she was. She'd been walking alone for days, chasing quiet, hoping the wide, empty places might finally hush the noise inside. She wanted to outrun the shadows that clung to her heels, searching for something she didn't have a name for. A bone-deep hunger for peace. Answers that had stayed just out of reach for too long. But exhaustion had finally caught her. Calyx felt her stubborn will starting to crack. Every stride took more effort than the last, the whole damn journey pressing down like a lead saddle. Miles of rough country behind her, and still no mercy from the trail. She kept hoping for a flat spot to catch her breath, but the restlessness gnawed harder the farther she went. That was when she spotted him. Tall shadow standing right where the path bent, half hidden in the deep shade of the big ponderosas. He stood straight and still, sharp cheekbones, eyes like black flint. Calm power rolled off him in waves. Calyx slowed without thinking, pulse hammering as she studied him. Dressed in the old way, fringed buckskin, long dark hair tied back, he looked carved from the land itself, watching her with a gaze that cut straight through. Life had taught her to trust no one, especially not a stranger who appeared out of nowhere. She knew better than to drop her guard. And yet, something about him felt different, a pull she couldn't shake, like the air itself had shifted. As if he read her hesitation, he stepped forward. Smooth, quiet, moving like he belonged to the trees and the wind. His eyes held hers, fierce and strangely gentle at the same time, impossible to read. "Lift your legs higher," he said, voice low and steady, almost swallowed by the forest. Calyx blinked, startled. She searched his face for a joke, for anything soft, but there was only quiet certainty. No tease, no threat, just calm conviction. She was used to going her own way, answering to no one, but those 4 words hit something deep inside. No fight rose up. It felt right, like some part of her had been waiting for exactly that order. She glanced up the trail, jagged rocks, a brutal climb to the ridge ahead. The ground looked mean and unsteady. She knew she had to keep moving, but right then the slope felt like a wall she'd never clear. Her legs burned, her heart carried too much. Yet when that voice spoke again in her memory, something cracked open inside her chest. Without a second thought, she obeyed. She raised her knees higher, drove forward with fresh fire. The motion felt strange at first. Awkward, almost wrong. But it woke something she'd forgotten she still had. Purpose. Each step hammered home the truth. Strength still lived in her, buried but breathing. She looked back once. Jett Hollow had fallen in behind her, silent as a shadow, steady as the mountains. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. His presence alone carried weight, solid, wordless support that steadied her spine. She kept climbing. Muscles screamed, lungs burned, but something else was moving inside her. This wasn't just walking anymore. She was rising. Above the ache. Above the old fear. Toward something bright and unnamed. It wasn't only about lifting her boots higher. It was about climbing out of every cage she'd ever locked herself inside. And right then, Calyx understood. This whole hard road wasn't only about reaching the end. It was the trail itself. The strangers who crossed your path. The quiet lessons carved into every mile. As Calyx Thorn and Jett Hollow kept moving deeper into the wild, something unspoken began to change between them. At first, she'd held herself apart, walls high, every old hurt standing guard. But day after day, walking beside the tall Apache, those walls started to crack. It wasn't only his strength that pulled her in, or the calm way he handled every hardship. It was the way he moved, sure-footed, unhurried, at home in the wide world, the quiet current of understanding that flowed without words. With every sunrise, Calyx saw more clearly. Jett Hollow wasn't like anyone she'd ever met on the trail. He didn't try to own her, didn't judge the broken pieces she carried. He simply saw her, really saw her, and that alone was new. Sometimes he'd look at her with that steady, quiet fire in his eyes, like he already knew every scar she hid, every night she'd cried alone. Yet he never demanded she speak. Never pried. He just stayed near, a calm anchor that made the whole damn world feel less heavy. Mornings on the trail, he'd offer small, plain words. Where to step, how to save strength, when to take a pull from the canteen she kept forgetting. No shouting, no orders barked, just that low, even voice, smooth as river stone, that somehow quieted the storm in her head. "Lift your legs higher," he'd murmur again. This time Calyx didn't pause, didn't question. She simply did it, because she trusted him, bone deep, the way she'd never trusted anyone before. She knew in her gut Jett Hollow wouldn't push her past what she could bear. In his shadow she felt guarded, like nothing out here could touch her. His words weren't mere trail directions. They carried a silent vow. Protection. Steady guidance through whatever hell the land threw next. Calyx Thorn had spent years counting only on herself, muscling through every storm, every heartbreak, never cracking the door for anyone else. But Jett's quiet power, unshakable, wordless, started prying at the hinges of that old habit. Around him, the armor she'd always worn felt heavy, unnecessary. She didn't have to play the unbreakable lone rider anymore. In his company, she could drop the act, let the cracks show, be the bruised, uncertain woman underneath. And strangely, that was enough. Days rolled on. Calyx started seeing the finer things about him. The sharp way he caught a shift in the wind, the faint change in birdsong others never noticed, how he read the sky like an open book and knew rain or heat was coming long before it arrived. He moved with the country, not against it. Easy, rooted, alive to every whisper of the wild. Without thinking, she began copying that rhythm, trying to match his effortless stride. The knot of tension she'd carried for years started to loosen. She let herself feel the pulse of the earth under her soles, the slow heartbeat of the land. With Jett Hollow walking beside her, the world stopped feeling like an enemy to conquer. It became something to move with, to breathe alongside. At night, when the fire snapped low and the stars burned cold overhead, Calyx found words spilling out she'd never planned to say. She spoke of the old wounds, the fears that still woke her sweating, the people and promises she'd lost, the ache she'd buried so deep she almost forgot it was there. Jett Hollow listened, not with soft pity or quick fixes, but with a silence that understood more than words ever could. He didn't interrupt, didn't preach, didn't try to patch her up like a busted cinch strap. He just sat there, letting her unload at her own pace, letting the hurt breathe. In that patient quiet, Calyx began to see what real trust looked like. It wasn't having every answer lined up or pretending you were unbreakable. It was daring to be raw, daring to admit you couldn't shoulder the whole damn world by yourself. And in that small, brave act of letting go, the healing started. Slow, piece by piece, like dawn creeping over the ridges. The trail had turned into something bigger than miles and mountains. Day by day, Calyx grew tougher, muscle and soul both, forged in the hard light of the open country. She trusted Jett Hollow now with more than her life. She trusted him with the fragile, hopeful thing beating inside her chest. His steady presence had become her North Star, proof she wasn't walking this empty land alone. But the wilderness doesn't let you rest easy for long. Ahead lay a fresh test, one that would drag her right to the ragged edge of what she thought she could endure. They reached a deep cut in the earth, a narrow, ugly chasm, sides sharp with broken rock and loose shale. Across the gap, the trail picked up again, snaking toward far-off peaks that looked close enough to touch and impossibly distant at the same time. Frustration boiled up in Calyx's chest like bad coffee. The jump looked flat-out impossible. Too wide. Too treacherous. One wrong step, and you were gone. Turning around felt like quitting, like admitting she wasn't strong enough after all. She hated that taste more than anything. Yet standing there, staring into the drop, the thing seemed to laugh at her. Jett Hollow stood at the lip of the ravine, calm as a still pond, while everything inside Calyx churned like a flash flood. He turned, met her eyes with that same even gaze that had carried her this far. No blame, no hurry, just the same deep-rooted strength that had never wavered. "Lift your legs higher," he whispered, voice low and solid as ever. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she stared down into the dark throat of the gorge. Those 4 words, so simple on the trail, suddenly felt heavy as iron. What if she slipped? What if she fell? The fear roared, swallowing everything. But beneath it another voice whispered. This wasn't only about crossing rock and air. This was about crossing something inside her own skin. She pulled in a long breath, thoughts racing. The ravine taunted her. Go ahead. Try. Fail. She glanced back at Jett Hollow. He stood rooted, certain, never doubting her for a second. That quiet faith in her had always been there, silent, steady, nudging her to believe the same. Calyx stepped forward. Her boot scraped stone. She set one foot on the crumbling edge, testing. It wobbled, but it held. With Jett's words ringing in her ears, she lifted the other leg higher, easing onto the narrow shelf. Pulse thundered in her throat. Fear gnawed, but she kept moving. She found the same rhythm that had carried her through every tough stretch before. Slow, deliberate, alive. Step by step, confidence crept in. This wasn't just a physical gap she was crossing. She was climbing out of every doubt that had chained her for years. The doubts that used to scream grew quieter, drowned by a fierce new sense of purpose. The ledge trembled. The drop yawned below, dizzying. But with each careful shift of weight, she pushed past the old limits she'd set for herself. At last she hauled herself over the far rim. She stood there, chest heaving, legs shaking, not from terror this time, but from pure, hard-won victory. She'd done it. She'd stared down the test and walked out the other side. The power she'd always doubted lived right inside her, had been there the whole damn way. Patient, waiting for her to claim it. Jett Hollow stood a few paces back, eyes locked on her, dark and steady with a pride that needed no words. No big speeches, no slaps on the back. None were required. Calyx Thorn understood now. This whole hard ride wasn't about earning applause from anybody else. It was about digging deep and finding the grit to smash through what she once swore was unbreakable. That ravine hadn't just been a gap in the dirt. It had been a reckoning. She saw clear as day that the real walls in life weren't made of rock and drop-offs. They were the ones built in her head and heart. Fears, shame, old hurts that cut deeper than any canyon. And for the first time, she believed she could tear them down, one stubborn step at a time. As Calyx Thorn and Jett Hollow kept pushing deeper into the wild, a slow change took root inside her. The miles they'd covered felt small next to the ground she'd gained in her own soul. The terror, the second-guessing, the nagging voices that used to own her, they weren't chains anymore. Day after day, a quiet shift stirred way down in her core. It wasn't something you could pin down with fancy words or point to on a map, but she felt it, bone deep. Ground that once looked impossible, trails that once seemed deadly, walls that once felt eternal. Now they were just part of the ride. She didn't dread what waited around the next bend anymore. A new lightness settled over her, freedom she hadn't tasted in years. The old baggage, regrets, failures, the sharp edges of pain, no longer dragged her down like a busted pack mule. Jett Hollow had been right all along with those 4 words. Lift your legs higher. It stopped being about boots and rocks. It became a whole new way of walking the world. Eyes up, shoulders back, rising above every limit she'd ever set on herself. With every mile they shared, Calyx tuned herself tighter to the land and to the woman she was becoming. Jett Hollow never preached a lesson, never sat her down for a talk. Yet he showed her everything. How to read the sky's mood, how to hear the wind's warning, how to sense the smallest shift in the air. She learned to step with purpose, to cross rough ground with a kind of grace she never knew she had, to keep going even when the trail vanished into shadow. She quit seeing herself as a lone fighter scrapping against everything. Instead, she felt woven into the wild, part of it, bound to it, and above all, strong enough to belong in it. Nights under a sky thick with stars, Calyx sat by the fire and let her mind wander back over the miles. Jett Hollow sat across the flames, his outline sharp against the glow, solid as the peaks ringing the horizon. She realized she'd stopped asking where she fit, stopped begging for permission to exist. No more proving, no more performing. She was starting to trust the quiet strength that had always been hers. Not the brittle kind she'd forced out of fear, but the deep, steady kind that simply was. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the hills and the valley stretched out wide and wild below, Calyx stood at the cliff's edge. Wind brushed her face. Trees whispered secrets, and for the first time in forever she felt the blood singing in her veins, alive, truly alive. Jett Hollow stepped up behind her, close enough to feel, but giving her room. No words passed between them. The silence said everything that needed saying. She knew then, The trail wasn't about reaching some far-off line on a map. It was about the woman who got remade along the way. The change had crept in soft at first, easy to miss, until it wasn't. It was solid now, real as the ground under her feet. Calyx no longer hid the cracks. She let the old pain rise, felt its weight, but refused to let it own her. Those scars weren't chains anymore. They were chapters, hard-earned lines in the story of who she'd become. With Jett Hollow's steady shadow at her back and the wild land working its slow medicine, she found something she'd hunted for years. Peace. Deep and hard-won. Right then she understood. Real change doesn't hit like lightning. It isn't one big moment or one brave choice. It's 1,000 small steps, a slow opening up, a gentle release of everything that used to hold her hostage. She'd mastered lifting her legs higher. Now she was learning to lift her spirit higher, to stand taller in her own skin. She wasn't scared of tomorrow anymore. Whatever rode in on the next wind, she was ready to meet it. Jett Hollow had been the spark, no question, but the fire was hers. She'd lit it herself, faced down her demons, and walked out stronger. And for the first time, Calyx Thorn knew the truest prize of the trail wasn't the miles behind her. It was the woman staring back from inside her own eyes. As Calyx Thorn and Jett Hollow pressed farther into the untamed country, the cadence of their days began to shift. The very air felt different, thicker, charged with something neither could ignore. Calyx had shed so much of the old weight. She moved lighter, trusted herself more, believed in the path under her feet. But the deeper they went into the unknown, a new storm brewed inside her, one that had nothing to do with rocks or rivers and everything to do with what came next. It started small. Her mind would wander when the trail went quiet, slipping back to the life she'd left behind. The clapboard house, the voices of kin, the faces she once called family. For the first time in years, those memories pushed forward, refusing to stay buried. She'd run hard and far, convinced distance would erase them. But the past doesn't vanish because you ride away from it. It rides right along, patient, waiting for the moment you slow down enough to hear it call. It felt to Calyx Thorn as if the specters of the life she had fled were finally closing the distance, breathing their doubts against the back of her thoughts. Jett Hollow, ever watchful, noticed the shift in her long before she admitted it to herself. He had spoken little since they crossed the deep ravine, and she had once welcomed his steady silence, yet now that quiet seemed to carry a weight of its own. He moved beside her like a man who could sense storms before they broke, but he never demanded explanations. He only waited, patient and unhurried, as though he understood that the choice waiting for Calyx Thorn was hers alone to claim. One evening, when the sun slipped behind the far hills and painted the sky in burning shades of copper and violet, she found herself standing at the lip of a high cliff, with nothing but wind for company. The country spread below her like an endless sea of stone and grass, beautiful enough to steal a breath, yet her chest felt tight and heavy. She could feel the pull of two different lives, one she had abandoned, and another she was only beginning to step into with Jett Hollow. The struggle inside her was no longer only about yesterday. It was about tomorrow, and what it meant to keep walking toward something she could not yet name. "I can't keep running," Calyx Thorn murmured, her voice thin against the evening breeze. In that instant, she understood that flight had never truly saved her. The wounds, the missteps, the chances she had let slip away would always live somewhere beneath her skin, but they did not have to rule her. She did not have to breathe in constant dread of them. Not anymore. Even as the thought settled, another ache rose to challenge it. The idea of leaving Jett Hollow behind twisted at her heart. He had become more than a guide through rough country. He had become a companion, a man who showed her that trust could exist without chains, that vulnerability did not always end in betrayal, that life could be more than simple survival. She had allowed hope to take root again, yet that hope felt as delicate as a spider's thread. Jett Hollow, sensing the storm she carried inside, approached without a sound. He asked no questions and offered no quick remedies. He only stood beside her, lending comfort without weight. Calyx Thorn turned to him, the decision in her chest heavy as river stone. "I don't know if I can keep going," she admitted, the confession spilling out before pride could stop it. "I'm caught between two worlds. One I've buried, and one I don't understand yet. I don't know what waits ahead." Jett Hollow studied her a long moment, his face unreadable, yet something in his eyes spoke of deep knowing, of a wisdom earned far from words. At last he answered, calm as still water. "You don't have to see the whole road," he said. His voice carried a gentle certainty. "The trail will show itself one step at a time. Trust yourself, Calyx Thorn. You've already walked farther than you believe." The simplicity of it struck her harder than any speech could have. She had been trying to command every turn of fate, desperate to own all the answers before moving a single inch. But life had never bowed to such demands. It asked only for faith in motion, in herself, in the unseen shape of the path. In that breath, she saw that her war inside was not a choice between what had been and what might be. It was learning how to carry both without breaking, honoring the scars while reaching for the light ahead. She did not have to abandon everything to move forward. She only had to take the next step, believing she was strong enough for what followed. The battle within her was not finished, but Calyx Thorn had made a quiet truce with it. She did not require every answer. She needed only to continue. With Jett Hollow at her side, she felt able to meet whatever lay waiting in the miles beyond. The journey had turned a corner. Calyx Thorn, once certain that control was her only shield, stood in the middle of a soft revelation. The fights she had waged against memory, emotion, and the hard wilderness had taught her a single truth above all others. Strength was not only in pushing or striking back. Sometimes it lived in surrender. Not the surrender of defeat, but of understanding. She saw now how fiercely she had tried to master every piece of her life, to outrun the ghosts that followed her name, and how weary that struggle had made her. She had guarded her independence like a fort, yet those walls had kept out more than danger. They had kept out the world itself. The tighter she clung to them, the farther she drifted from what truly mattered: connection, trust, and a measure of peace. The change in her thinking came clearly one night beside a low campfire. The darkness lay quiet, except for the pop of burning wood and the soft sigh of wind in the branches. Jett Hollow sat across from her, relaxed but watchful, giving her the room he always offered. He had said little all evening, yet the air between them felt different, charged with something unspoken. Calyx Thorn could feel her old grief and doubts pressing close, but beneath them stirred a truth she had long refused to meet. She had always been the one who stood alone, who solved her own troubles and never reached for a hand. But with Jett Hollow, another way had revealed itself. He had shown her that strength did not mean solitude, that knowing when to lean on another could be braver than standing rigid on her own. It was a lesson she had not wanted, yet one her heart was finally ready to learn. The words Jett Hollow once spoke drifted back to Calyx Thorn like smoke from an old fire. "Lift your legs higher," he had told her, and she had obeyed without question, believing it was only instruction for the body. Now she understood it had always meant more. Staring into the glowing coals, she saw how long she had been wrestling with herself, trying to cage her feelings as if they were wild horses to be broken. In doing so, she had fenced her own heart, mistaking restraint for strength. The surrender rising in her was not defeat at all, but release. Letting go of the need to command every turn of fate, to stand flawless and unshaken. For the first time, she dared to be fragile, and saw that fragility could carry power of its own. Jett Hollow noticed the change, yet said nothing. He never needed to. His nearness was enough. Calyx Thorn closed her eyes, drew a deep breath, and felt her shoulders soften, the iron grip of fear loosening at last. She understood then that her road was not only about enduring or proving her worth, but about welcoming the unknown and trusting she could meet it. Firelight flickered in her gaze, and she realized that real strength came from accepting what could not be ruled, from knowing the pieces of life did not have to fit at once. Existence was no war to be conquered, but a long trail to be walked. And sometimes the bravest act was to believe in the journey, in herself, and in the man beside her. Jett Hollow. The walls she had raised so carefully began to fall away, stone by stone, and she felt lighter than she had in years. In the hush of night, she breathed a simple vow to the darkness. It's all right to surrender. With Jett Hollow's quiet guidance, she learned that the deepest courage often lived in letting go, not only of yesterday, but of the urge to steer every tomorrow. In that release, she found peace and a fresh kind of freedom. Days started to fold into one another, each bringing a small but meaningful step ahead. Calyx Thorn and Jett Hollow traveled deeper into the wild country, every ridge and river teaching its own lesson. Yet beneath the beauty, she sensed an empty corner, still waiting to be filled. She had changed, learned to trust, and to rise above what haunted her. But another truth was beginning to grow inside her. A clearer vision of who she was becoming and who she was meant to be. One evening, after a long march, they camped beside a slow river. The sun slid low, painting the water with gold. Calyx Thorn sat near the bank, listening to the steady current, and for a moment allowed the stillness to wash through her bones. She had traveled far since the day she first met Jett Hollow. The past no longer crushed her, and the future no longer frightened her, yet something stirred within. A feeling she had not named before. Jett Hollow worked at the fire nearby, his presence a firm anchor in shifting ground. Watching him, Calyx Thorn grasped a hard truth. She had never believed herself worthy of being loved or cherished. She had measured her worth by scars and survival, by standing alone. Independence had been her only law. But with Jett Hollow, that image of herself seemed to fade like an old photograph. She was no longer merely enduring. She had begun to live again. It was not only about learning to lift her legs higher or crossing rough ground. It was about discovering she was more than the sum of her fears. Calyx Thorn had always called herself strong, yet only in surrender did she glimpse the full reach of that strength. She had thought power meant holding everything tight and needing no one. Now, beside the river, she saw that true might grew from openness, from trusting the unknown, from believing in others and in her own heart. Her thoughts drifted to the quiet hours when Jett Hollow had guided her with little more than a few steady words and a patient shadow at her side. "Lift your legs higher." The phrase had become a signpost for her life, a way of rising above obstacles that once loomed like mountains. Jett Hollow had never tried to remake her. He had simply trusted what she could become, showing her she was capable of more than she imagined. Calyx Thorn remembered the day they crossed the ravine, the fear that clawed at her, the doubt she conquered step by step. The struggle had been necessary, proof that she could face what seemed impossible. Looking back now, she understood the greatest discovery had not been her muscle or endurance, but her willingness to accept herself, flaws, history, and uncertainty alike. The realization settled over her with a gentle calm, like evening settling on the plains. It was as if Calyx Thorn had been hunting for some lost piece of herself across every mile, only to learn it had been resting inside her all along. She had spent so many years chasing survival, outrunning pain like a rider fleeing a storm, that she had forgotten what it meant to truly live. Now the blood in her veins felt warmer, her breath deeper, and she sensed a kind of life she had never tasted before. Calyx Thorn turned toward Jett Hollow, who had been watching her without a word. Their eyes met, and in his gaze she saw more than a tracker of trails. She saw a companion who had stood witness to her slow remaking. He offered no speech, yet his presence spoke louder than any sermon. The understanding blooming inside her belonged to her alone, yet it felt shared between them, like a secret held in open air. "I understand now," Calyx Thorn murmured, voice steady but trembling with feeling. Jett Hollow did not answer, but the small tilt of his head told her he already knew. He always had. She had learned to lift her legs higher, to climb above the shadows of yesterday, to trust the slow shaping of her own spirit. But now she saw the next bend in the road was not only about breathing another day or finding comfort. It was about stepping fully into the woman she had become, walking forward with grace and the knowledge that she could meet whatever waited ahead. Calyx Thorn smiled to herself while watching the river slide by, a tireless ribbon of life that never paused. For the first time, she felt at peace with the journey still unrolling before her. She rose and walked to the cliff's edge where the land stretched wide and wild. The sinking sun washed the sky with orange, rose, and violet, laying a gentle glow across the rough country below. The valley rolled on without end, distant peaks promising both hardship and hope. It was a sight fit to steal a soul, yet Calyx Thorn no longer felt like an outsider looking in. She felt rooted to it, claimed by it, belonging in a way she once believed impossible. The trail had been long, and she had met more trials than she ever imagined a single woman could bear. She had crossed dark hours, wrestled her own devils, and faced the sharp bones of her past. But standing there above the open land, she understood the fiercest fight had lived inside her chest. She had learned to trust, to yield, to climb beyond fear and the limits she had built. Above all, she had learned to accept herself. Jett Hollow stood near, steady as the mountains. He said nothing, yet an unspoken bond lay between them, forged through shared miles and hard nights. Calyx Thorn looked at him and saw not just a warrior of the plains, but a man who had walked beside her through every painful turning. Jett Hollow had asked only one thing, that she trust him. And through that trust, he had helped her uncover the strength she had carried from the start. For the first time, there was no hesitation in her heart. She had spent so long fighting the current of her own life, trying to dam every stream, bury every scarred corner of her soul. Now, With evening wind touching her face, and the wide world spread before her, she saw that life was not meant to be tamed. It was meant to be lived, moment after moment, each one a chance to learn and grow and move on. She had always called herself a survivor. That name had followed her like a brand. She had survived the past, the ache, the loneliness that howled in the dark. But survival no longer satisfied her. She wanted to live fully, to thrive, to feel the whole measure of being human, without hiding. In that instant, Calyx Thorn knew she was ready to begin again, not as the woman she had been, but as the woman rising within her. Through the long road she had gathered many lessons, yet the greatest wore the face of acceptance. She had accepted love she once feared, vulnerability she once fled, and the truth of her own power. The walls she had raised were no longer needed. She was not the guarded, solitary figure bent under memory's weight. She had released her grip, and freedom had answered. The trail ahead remained uncertain, but the unknown no longer frightened her. She had learned that uncertainty was not an enemy, but a doorway. Life would still throw hard weather across her path, yet she had found the grit to face it, the wisdom to know when to stand firm, and the grace to know when to loosen her hold. Calyx Thorn turned to Jett Hollow with a deep well of gratitude. He had never tried to reshape her. He had only pointed the way. His quiet knowing had sparked her change, but the transformation was hers to claim. Jett Hollow had been a mirror showing the courage and beauty she had always carried unseen. Drawing a long breath, Calyx Thorn stepped forward, the first stride into a fresh beginning. She did not know what lay beyond the next ridge, but fear no longer ruled her. The future, once a dark canyon, now felt like an open canvas waiting for her choices and dreams. With Jett Hollow beside her and the vast country ahead, Calyx Thorn stood ready for whatever came. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you. Aviso Legal/Disclaimer. These stories are crafted purely for entertainment and may contain imaginative additions or dramatic interpretations inspired by old frontier eras. We use AI-based resources, voice, imagery, and drafting, as part of our creative process, but every final detail is carefully reviewed and shaped by human effort to preserve emotional depth and authenticity. We strictly follow YouTube's rules regarding AI-generated content and refrain from deepfakes, altered identities, or misleading representations. All images, sounds, and related materials are lawfully obtained. Please do not reuse, modify, or distribute any portion of this content without written permission. Thank you for valuing creativity, respect, and original work.